record button. And I want to let you all know, do due diligence. We are going to be recording this session. So as of now, the session is being recorded. And there are a couple of other little housekeeping things I want to make you aware of. Please stay muted and keep your cameras off during the presentations. Only the speaker should be visible while they are presenting. I will encourage you all to turn your cameras on during the question and answer session at the end so that we can all see one another's faces, as we're having a discussion. We will proceed for the panel in the order that the panelists are listed in the program. And you can feel free to send questions into the chat throughout the presentations. I will hold all of the questions until the end of the panel, until everybody is done presenting. Have at least 15 minutes at the end for discussion, but you can, again, feel free to send questions in the chat throughout the panel, and I will pull from the chat at the end when we have time for questions. And I think that's all of my housekeeping information. So we will get started. I am going to share the screen for our first panelist, and I will introduce Betty now. So Betty, if you'd like to turn on your camera, you can. So Betty Livingston Adams will be presenting a paper titled "In the Political Arena, African American Women and the Vote, from Civic Righteousness to Electoral Politics." Dr. Adams holds a Doctor of Philosophy and a Master of Philosophy degrees from Yale University and a Master of Divinity degree from Drew University. Her most recent publication, Black Women's Christian Activism, Seeking Social Justice in a Northern Suburb, was published by New York University Press in 2016, received the 2018 New Jersey Studies Academic Alliance Author Award for Scholarly Excellence, and the 2017 Wilbur Award for Excellence in Communicating Religious Issues, Values, and Themes with Professionalism, Fairness, and Honesty. It also received the 2019 Cornitzer Prize for Nonfiction from Drew University, and it has appeared on Book Authority's list of best social action books since 2018. Dr. Adams' scholarship and teaching explore 19th and 20th century African American and American religious and social history through the lens of gender, race, and class. She has held faculty appointments at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, Drew University, and Southern University. A former corporate manager, Dr. Adams is an associate minister at Fountain Baptist Church in Summit, New Jersey. So welcome, Dr. Adams. I'm going to share your
Good morning. Can you hear me? Good. And do I need to do something with the screen, or are we okay?
You're okay.
Okay, good. And the first slide would be the portraits. Yep, there we go. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here, and I am very anxious about being virtual, but we'll see how it works. The title of this conversation is "In the Political Arena, African American Women and the Vote, from Civic Righteousness to Electoral Politics." By the time women gained the right to vote in August 1920, New Jersey's Black women were already, quote, "an important political factor," end quote. African American women in New Jersey had tried for decades to effect progressive social change without participating in electoral politics. Initially, they claimed civic space based upon their Christian service. Later, they contended that their sacrifices as women and mothers during World War I had earned them the right to be heard. Finally, in 1920, they demanded a place as enfranchised citizens. For working women who had to fight for respect from white women and Black and white men, the ballot was a sacred instrument, one that represented personal protection and social justice. In the time we have together, I'd like to introduce you to two women, Violet Johnson and Florence Spearing Randolph. Slide, please. Both were leaders in Black women's transition to electoral politics from civic righteousness. That is, placing morality in the realm of public policy and laws. And that's transition from civic righteousness to social justice. In 1897, 27-year-old North Carolina native Violet Johnson relocated with her white employers from Brooklyn, New York to Summit, New Jersey. The white churches accepted Black members. Johnson opted to organize a Bible study group for African Americans employed in the homes and hotels in this emerging and avowedly liberal Protestant suburb. Within a year, the group became an officially recognized Baptist church. In 1925, Reverend Florence Fearing Randolph, a South Carolina native and Jersey City resident, accepted an interim appointment to a fledgling African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Summit, and during the Great Depression, built it into an institutional church that served the entire community. The world in which Black women lived and worked was highly sexualized, gendered, and raced. As working women and Southern migrants living and working on the margins, their personal lives were never private. Highly visible yet morally suspect, they were under the gaze of Black male ministers and white middle-class women. Because of their gender, they remained in subordinate positions within their own churches, while in white women's organizations, their race created conflict. Yet, like their white and Black middle-class sisters, these working women participated in available discourses and accepted Victorian values and social conventions. However, by some significant measures, their story is unique. When ordinary working women like Violet Johnson and Florence Randolph entered civic space, their mere presence challenged the status quo. From the latter decades of the 19th century through the 20th, Black women's intertwined religious and secular networks contested the valorization of the public sphere as white, middle-class Protestant space. Their willingness to confront hegemonic assumptions of gender, race, and class amid the nationalization of Jim Crow segregation mattered. It mattered in the churches they built, the civic and social institutions they created, and the communities they sustained. They negotiated alliances across boundaries and axes of constructed identity and power. They collaborated with leading women's reform movements, that is the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and transformed the white middle-class New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association into an interracial organization. In the 1920s and 30s, they converted their Christian service into a force in electoral politics. They were state, regional, and national leaders. Yet they continually had to negotiate a rigid gender line in their denominations and a moving color line in their community. The harder they worked, the tighter the lines encircled them. Though their goals evolved and their language changed from civic righteousness to civil rights, their basic strategy of community organizing remained constant. So did their commitment to social justice, which they defined as just laws and moral institutions. Initially, Johnson and Randolph entered civic space through their church work, while their missionary and temperance organizations taught them leadership and negotiating skills. This woman's work often brought them into conflict with male pastors who held different views of church women's roles. On the other hand, though the Women's Christian Temperance Union fit with their brand of gendered activism, including suffrage support, it was not always amenable to their experience of race. Many Black women consequently opted to form separate organizations rather than be subordinate to their white sisters who failed to treat them with respect as equals. Ultimately, Black women's agency led them beyond the walls of the church and beyond interracial sisterhood. Following resounding defeat in 1915 of both the Prohibition and women's suffrage referenda, for which white middle-class women blamed Black and European immigrant women, New Jersey's Black Baptist and Methodist missionary women voted to organize their own independent, statewide Women's Christian Temperance Union. However, during their initial meeting in Trenton, the women declared their organizational independence from Black men and white women by forming the New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, the first secular organization many had ever joined. Slide, please. And here you see the letterhead of the New Jersey State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. They adopted as their motto, "Work and serve the hour." The following year, the women affiliated with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, organized in 1896, and added to their letterhead, the national organization's motto, lifting as they climb. With formation of the state federal, working class African-American women across New Jersey reached a new level of public visibility and political and organizational autonomy. And that's the last of the slides. So we can move those out of the way, I guess.
But we'll move to the second presentation on the program, which is Suffrage Ran in Families with Lisa Hendrickson. And to introduce Lisa, as an independent historian, Lisa Hendrickson has done extensive research on the women's suffrage movement in New Jersey. She has written 20 biographies of individual New Jersey suffragists and helped identify 20 more for contribution to the National Women and Social Movements online database project. Her research has also appeared on the discovernjhistory.org website as part of the statewide initiative New Jersey Women Vote, the 19th Amendment at 100, and on the National Votes for Women Trail website. Lisa recently joined the Alice Paul Institute's board of directors and created a traveling exhibit for them marking the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, titled Marketing the Movement, How Women Won the Right to Vote. The exhibit won the 2020 Burlington County History Award. Prior to this work, she was a senior vice president in charge of merchandising and design at Destination Maternity. So welcome, Lisa, and let me share your presentation with the group, and then I will turn myself off. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Good morning. I'm going to share with you stories about some amazing New Jersey suffragists and their families. Obtaining the right to vote for women was a very divisive issue in the US and also within families, though for some, women's suffrage became a family cause. Through my work with the National Suffrage Data Project, I have come to realize how many extraordinary women participated in the movement in New Jersey. As I continued down the rabbit hole of investigation, I also found that many were related, which led to my conclusion that suffrage ran in families. I will introduce 3 New Jersey families of privilege who embraced the suffrage movement: the Olmsted and Ogdens, the Stevens, and the Rileys. While they had money and social prominence to afford to take a stand, they could have chosen to sit on the sidelines or be part of the anti-faction. Instead, family members decided to be suffrage advocates and, in some cases, social reformers. The 3 families were connected by a shared belief and also personally knew each other through their extensive travel across the state. They gave speeches alongside each other, marched in parades together, and cajoled politicians together. The 8 women you will meet were strong, organized, and detailed in their approach to life and supporting the movement. Male allies were vital to the success of the women's suffrage movement, and many of the men who advocated for the movement were political and business kingmakers. The 3 men you will meet were supportive of the strong women in their lives, both financially and emotionally, while actively participating in suffrage events. Together, these committed families persevered, believing that a woman's right to vote was an essential element of equality. Slide, please. The first families I will introduce you to are the Ogdens and Olmsteds. Margaret Madge Stearns Olmsted, born in 1874, was from a family of railroad superintendents and merchants. In 1904, Margaret married Archibald Gracie Ogden, who was a descendant of one of the original founders of Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Teddy Roosevelt was a cousin by marriage. Archibald Gracie was a banker at Brown Brothers Investment Bank, and Margaret was a stay-at-home mother and socialite involved in many charitable organizations. While there's not much specifically written on her actual involvement in the suffrage movement, she was supportive financially and emotionally to family members who were directly involved, including her sister, Catherine Olmsted Price, and her sisters-in-law, Esther Gracie Ogden and Clementine Ladley Olmsted. Not everyone in the Olmsted family was for the suffrage cause. Uncle Johnny Owen Stearns, a confirmed bachelor, was anti-suffrage. Sister-in-law Clementine Ladley Olmsted, the daughter of a Civil War veteran, was born in Michigan in 1878 and grew up in New York State and Washington, D.C. She married Margaret's brother, Edward Olmsted, a decorated military officer and mechanical engineer. Clementine was a socialite who was very active in many organizations. Although there is not a record of when she first joined the movement, she was elected treasurer of the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association in 1913, a position she held for many years. In May 1915, she used her fundraising skills to support the suffrage ball held by the Elizabeth Equal Suffrage League and attended the New Jersey Victory Convention at the Robert Treat Hotel in 1920. Sister-in-law Esther Gracie Ogden, born in 1866, was the most notable suffragist of the family. On her mother's side, she was a descendant of the well-known Gracie family of New York. She was the great-granddaughter of Archibald Gracie, a Scottish merchant whose home is now the New York City mayor's residence. Her mother's cousin, Archibald Gracie IV, survived the sinking of the Titanic. Slide, please. Esther attended the School of Social Work and Columbia University. In 1912, she joined the suffrage movement, and by 1913, she was president of the Elizabeth Equal Suffrage League. Esther traveled the state of New Jersey, giving powerful lectures to many suffrage organizations, as shown in the newspaper clipping. As happens today, Ogden accused the antis of creating fake news in 1914 when they published a fabricated quote. In her rebuke, she said, "The antis must be hard pushed to find material for their press notes when they have to fill up space with such silly fabrications." She traveled extensively for the cause, crisscrossing the country doing field work, such as her 1916 trip to Colorado and California, where she urged women to organize demonstrations and conventions. She enthusiastically spoke about one of the suffrage automobile tours represented by the Votes for Women automobile photo, saying, "They set out to make a circuit of the United States with the same determination that we all have set out to win our enfranchisement, and they will not give up until the circuit is made." Esther's main interest was in publishing suffrage literature. By 1914, she had joined the National Women's Suffrage Publishing Company as the treasurer and was its president from 1916 to 1920. She said, "We exist for two purposes: to serve the suffrage cause throughout the country and to prove that we can serve the cause and also develop a successful business." They supplied printed flyers, leaflets, books, posters, and suffrage maps across the United States, and also produced playing cards, stationery, calendars, postcards, and parasols printed with Votes for Women. Some examples of the flyers and maps are pictured here. During the New York campaign of 1917, the National Women's Suffrage Publishing Company published and distributed over 10 million pieces of suffrage material for that state alone. Amazing. At the Victory Convention in 1920, Esther reported that the company had printed and distributed 50 million pieces of suffrage literature that had gone to almost every state, as well as many countries overseas. In a 1940 letter written to one of her nieces, she said, "As you know, my tiny part in the struggle for women's suffrage covered only the last 8 years, from 1912 to 1920, but they are the years of my life to me were the most worthwhile. I often think of how you, as a very little girl, used to ride in my Model T Ford adorned with Votes for Women pennants." Esther may have been speaking about her niece, Margaret, who at age 9 had her own reasons for supporting the suffrage movement, which she shared in an essay to her mother in saying, "Suffrage is better than anti in many ways. One, they make more money. They don't get so sick as antis. Another, they work harder. And another, they don't crow like chickens. Another, they make better cake." Important things to a 9-year-old. Slide, please. Members of the Stevens clan are shown here. Martha Bayard Stevens, the family matriarch, was the wife of Edwin Augustus Stevens, the son of Colonel John Stevens III, who purchased the land that would later comprise the city of Hoboken. Oh, back a slide, please. Earning the family the title, the First Family of Hoboken. Castle Point, the estate owned by the Stevens clan, shown top center, later became the city of Hoboken. Edwin was an engineer, inventor, and entrepreneur who organized one of the first railroads in the US. When he died in 1868, he donated land and money to create an institution of learning, which became known as the Stevens Institute of Technology. Martha Stevens led the philanthropic focus of her family, which included supporting women's suffrage and creating many social service organizations in Hoboken. Millicent Fenwick, the well-known Vogue editor and politician, was a family descendant. Daughter Caroline, also known as Caroline Stevens Alexander Whitpen, was born in Hoboken in 1859. At age 19, she married Archibald Alexander, a philosophy teacher whom she divorced in 1895. 20 years later, in 1915, Caroline married longtime friend and fellow advocate Henry Otto Whitpen. Caroline and her mother were extremely generous, contributing financially to over 100 social service organizations and institutions in New Jersey. Caroline and her brother Richard were penal reform activists who advocated for probation as an option in the criminal justice system. She urged for separate women's facilities in prison, believed that those who committed crimes could be rehabilitated or saved, and urged for better treatment of first-time offenders. Caroline was probably one of the best-known suffragists in the state of New Jersey. In 1910, she attended the first meeting of the New Jersey branch of the Equal Franchise League, held at the home of her sister-in-law, Mrs. Richard Stevens. In May of 1911, she marched as part of the New Jersey Equal Franchise League in the New York City suffrage parade held on Fifth Avenue. She also regularly traveled, giving speeches at many suffrage organizations across the state. In a 1915 newspaper article, when she was asked if she thought that women would win suffrage in New Jersey, she said, "Public opinion in New Jersey is rapidly becoming more enlightened. There is not a village and there is scarcely a household where suffrage is not stirring in some form or other." In 1920, Caroline and Esther Ogden traveled together to Columbus, Ohio, to make an appearance before the Democratic National Committee. Caroline worked diligently throughout her life to help improve the lives around her. At the time of her death, the New York Times referred to her as the best loved woman in New Jersey. How nice. Caroline's sister, Elizabeth Callender Stevens, most often known as Elsie, was born in 1868 in Hoboken and married her first cousin, Richard Stevens, in 1893. Elsie and her husband, Richard, regularly opened their home, Castle Point, for suffrage events and meetings. In 1910, the Stevens held the initial meeting of the New Jersey Equal Franchise Society at their Castle Point mansion. It was reported that nearly 300 women attended the meeting and 200 joined that day. The Equal Franchise Society attracted socially prominent men and women advocating women's suffrage. Of all the tactics women employed in winning the vote, few were as controversial or as upsetting to the upper class as the public parade. Elsie Stevens resigned her position in the New Jersey Equal Franchise Society rather than participate in the 1911 New York City parade. Her husband wanted her to reconsider, but she said, "Men do not have respect for women who will walk through the public streets in this manner. It is so undignified and so unwomanly. It will do no end of harm." Although Elsie did not march in the parade, Richard and his sister Caroline did march with the New Jersey contingent and all the other women around the country who marched in suffrage parades. Richard Stevens was the fourth son of Edwin H. Stevens. He was born in Paris in 1868, attended Columbia University, and earned a law degree in 1892. Although he established a law firm, he instead devoted himself to public policy and charity work. He and his sister Caroline worked together on many social issues, including justice reform. Richard was an ardent suffrage supporter, holding many meetings in his home and participating in meetings of the Men's League for Equal Suffrage. Caroline's second husband, Henry Otto Whitpen, was born in Jersey City to German immigrant parents. He was a grocery merchant, later becoming the youngest mayor of Jersey City in 1908, serving until 1913. Henry continued his public service by twice running for New Jersey governor and also served as the overseer of the Port of New York. He joined wife Caroline in advocating for women's suffrage by publicly signing support petitions in the newspaper and regularly attending meetings of the New Jersey Men's League for Equal Suffrage. Next slide, please. The final family you will meet is the Riley family. Louisa Lord Riley, born in 1836 in Philadelphia, had 4 brothers, one of whom, George W. Lord, married Martha Patricia Mott, the daughter of acclaimed suffragist Lucretia Coffin Mott. In 1870, Louisa married William Henry Riley. Louisa's involvement in women's groups began in 1872 when she brought 15 women together at her home and formed the Women's Club of Orange. She thought the club would be useful to the women of Orange in broadening their mental horizons and giving variety to their thoughts. It was the first women's club in New Jersey and the 4th in the United States. By 1894, the family moved to Ithaca, New York. Louisa likely attended the 1894 New York Women's Suffrage Convention held in Ithaca, which inspired her to start a local women's suffrage club. Noting that the women in Ithaca were quite conservative, she devised a club agenda that focused on socially acceptable issues and discussed suffrage only every 4th week. Ida Holt Riley, born in 1875 in New York, married Champlain Lord Riley in 1904. The couple became prominent members of the Plainfield, New Jersey community. Champlain attended Cornell University, studying mechanical engineering, and by 1913, he was a partner in an engineering consulting firm. Ida's first noted suffrage involvement was in 1907, when she was a New Jersey delegate at the National Suffrage Convention held in Chicago. She regularly spoke to women's groups and newspapers, giving pithy quotes like, "Suffragists believe that the dignity of a woman is not lost in doing her duty as a citizen. Her duty as a citizen will not interfere with her duty as a homemaker. Does a doctor's vote interfere with his medical practice? Does a businessman's vote interfere with his business?" Slide, please. As the leader in the Equal Suffrage League and the New Jersey Women Suffrage Association, she was present at many important suffrage events. In 1912, she was part of a large delegation that attended the suffrage resolution hearing at the State House in Trenton. She gave a report at the National Convention in Kentucky and joined the parade of approximately 15,000 men and 15,000 women and 1,000 men organized in New York City, shown at upper left. Shown below that, in 1913, Ida traveled to Newark to meet General Rosalie Jones and her suffrage army of invasion, who were on their hike to Washington. The Plainfield suffragists accompanied the army as far as Elizabeth. Suffrage Day, May 2nd, 1914, was celebrated across New Jersey with suffrage editions of newspapers and rallies. Champlain was chairman of the Suffrage Day program in Plainfield, while Ida, along with Lillian Feckert, took over the editing of the Plainfield Daily Press. These suffragists created the ideal newspaper from a woman's point of view. Ida was a charter member of the League of Women Voters of Plainfield, and by September 1920, more than 3,000 women in Plainfield had registered to vote. In 1910, Champlain Lord Riley was asked to form a men's league, and in his address said, "As the women cannot now vote unless the men give them that privilege, it is strictly up to men to do it. There was no better way than to begin by forming clubs with the aim of helping the cause along. That night, along with 17 other men, he formed the Men's League for Women's Suffrage. As its president, Champlain spoke at many suffrage meetings across the state, working with Lillian Feckert and Esther Ogden. It seems that Champlain also had a flair for the dramatic. He organized public events called Smokers, which offered an open discussion of equal suffrage along with unlimited pipes and tobacco to gain support among male voters. He had more than one battle with the antis who floated incorrect statements. He organized an entertainment shown at the top center. He organized an entertainment program titled Living Cartoons, but there were issues in getting a volunteer to play the man being harassed by his 5 female relatives as seen in the cartoon. He said, the object of a cartoon is not beauty or charm, but point and punch. At the center middle shows a poster and a newspaper clipping, which were part of the 1915 New Jersey Next campaign targeting male voters. At lower right shows a photo from the Passaic Daily News, which reported that the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, led by Champlain, bought a little yellow car, which they named Voter. The plan was to have Miss Eva Ward, an English suffragist, drive it across the state to engage with many voters. She explained, we are neutral on all questions but suffrage, and here to show our colors all the time, for Voter has a brilliant yellow campaign address. Hopefully I've painted a colorful picture of a part of the suffrage movement not often covered. As Hugh H. Lusk, a representative of the New Zealand Parliament, said in 1915, we find that equal suffrage is the greatest family bond and tie, the greatest strengthener of family life. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So we have Dr. Adams back, and before we move on to George's presentation, we're going to ask Dr. Adams to finish her presentation. I think we got just a little short of the halfway mark. So Dr. Adams, I'm not going to share the screen. I'm just going to let you talk because I think you were done with your slides anyway.
Yes, I was done with the slides. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I don't generally leave conversations so unceremoniously, so forgive me. As I left off, we were in 1915 and the African-American women had formed the independent New Jersey Republican Women's Club. Should I do something so that you can see me on this? Maybe I shouldn't touch anything at all. You can hear me, but you can't see me.
That's correct.
Okay, there we go. Like maybe you can see me now. I'll keep talking. So Black women had long been active members and leaders in auxiliaries to Black men's political organizations. Federation women asserted by 1915 that the structural and social evils, quote, sapping the manhood and womanhood of the race could only be addressed when women could vote. The ballot, wisely used, will bring to the Black woman the respect and protection that she needs to reckon with men who place no value upon her virtue and to mold healthy public sentiment in favor of her own protection. The ballot was the Black woman's weapon of defense, as well as an instrument of social justice. The Federation served as a bridge from missionary work to political activism. Moreover, the organizational presence changed the political calculus. In July 1917, during a morning session devoted to Federation business, in Plainfield, by the way, the suffrage department announced that the elite New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association had extended a verbal invitation to, quote, become identified with suffrage work in this state. Poignantly aware of the color line in the suffrage movement, Black women had reason to be wary. The verbal invitation, quote, precipitated a heated discussion, end quote, on the status of the State Women's Suffrage Association and the Federation of women's clubs, 2 whites-only women's groups. To avoid disrupting the meeting, President Randolph tabled the matter. However, that afternoon, the past and current presidents of the White Suffrage Association appeared uninvited to meet with the Black women. Whereas Black women may have been invisible to middle-class white suffragists in the past, by 1917, the political ground had shifted, and white women considered Black women's support a positive good for the cause. Adding nearly 3,000 Black club women and the thousands of women they represented to the pro-suffrage column would be a political coup. Black men in New Jersey voted, and their wives and daughters might convince them to vote for suffrage. Within 2 weeks after that meeting, a committee of 10 women, equally divided between the Colored Federation and the White Suffrage Association, reached an agreement that formalized Black women's membership on the Suffrage Association's executive board, specified the White Association's subvention of Black suffrage organizers and activities, and stipulated formation and affiliation of Black women's local suffrage organizations. Ratification of the agreement by the respective boards transformed New Jersey's suffrage campaign into a biracial and cross-class movement at a critical juncture. When the president of the White Women's Group issued a circular under the heading, "Bringing in the Colored Women," she assured white suffragists that the Black women were, quote, "all most intelligent, thoughtful, and worthwhile women," end quote. However, she failed to mention that she initiated the contact, or that the Black women accepted the invitation only after negotiating their requirements. According to Florence Randolph, the president of the Federation, it was the Black woman's duty to, quote, "strengthen and uplift American institutions and bring them into a higher degree of moral worth, and to ensure that every woman does her part to help make clean, just laws and see that they are enforced. So long as we are denied full privileges of citizenship, so long as in our cities and states we have Jim Crow, segregation, and other offensive measures, we must have wide awake Negro women," end quote. So being woke has a long history, it seems. Black women carried their religious convictions to the political arena and added politics to their service as they called for just laws and moral institutions. For Randolph Johnson and women of the Federation, organization mattered. Having learned the art of organizational effectiveness in their missionary societies and temperance unions, Black women converted their suffrage affiliation into a physical force. From April to November 1920, they formed county, ward, and district clubs and appointed precinct captains throughout the state. They held campaign rallies that had the sonic and visual markings of religious revivals. They linked individual and group progress to casting a ballot in local, state, and national elections. Their suffrage schools, voter registration drives, and get out the vote campaigns altered the political map and sent New Jersey's first Black assemblyman, Dr. Walter Alexander, suburban Essex County, to Trenton in 1920. Black working women became a powerful political presence. Armed with a ballot, these newly enfranchised women moved from reform and personal uplift to legislation and structural transformation. Because of their legislative effectiveness, the New Jersey legislature granted floor privileges to the chairwoman of the Federation's legislative department. In 1922, 200 enfranchised Black women representing 17 counties organized the State Colored Women's Republican Club with Florence Randolph as president. Violet Johnson served as a local president and later a state vice president. The Colored Women's Republican Club remained a powerful political force into the 1930s as they clarified issues and led get out the vote campaigns throughout the state. White and Black male male and white female politicians sought their endorsement and support. Nonetheless, these astute political actors discovered that the intersection of race, gender, and class was as fraught in the political arena as it was in religious organizations and women's reform movements. When African-American women sought Alice Paul's support to end the suppression of Black women's votes in the South, the president of the National Women's Party and staunch advocate of the Equal Rights Amendment refused, dismissing this as a race issue, not a women's or feminist matter. Again, when Black women publicly denounced state-sanctioned killings and mob violence directed at Black men and women, and subsequently organized the anti-lynching crusade and pressed for enactment of the federal anti-lynching bill, New Jersey's newly enfranchised white middle-class women demurred, though they did not hesitate to ask Randolph and Johnson to support the Equal Rights Amendment or to support increased funding for the state women's college that did not admit Black women. The decision to enter the political arena and thereby influence public policy and legislation was a major undertaking for women who funded their activities out of their meager earnings and had little access to major funding sources or personal wealth. Because of their political acumen and the respect accorded them in the political arena, one could easily forget that these savvy women wore uniforms and aprons. They scrubbed other people's floors and tended other women's children. They had to work quietly behind male denominational and civic leaders. Yet, when these same women entered the political arena, they received the respect denied to them in other spaces. Their organizational effectiveness made it impossible to deny that Black women were more than their work, or that they had identities as women and citizens in their own right. They operated on the principle of one woman, one vote. And when these working women cast their ballots, more than an election was at stake. They were, in their words, working for the upbuilding of the country, for the sustaining of their communities, and for the dignity of Black womanhood and manhood, as well as future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Okay, so our last presenter for the panel is, the paper is titled Jewish Suffragists in New Jersey. And George Robb received his PhD in history from Northwestern University. He was a Fulbright Scholar in the United Kingdom. His most recent books are British Culture and the First World War, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2015, second edition in 2015, and Ladies of the Ticker, Women and Wall Street from the Gilded Age to the Great Depression, University of Illinois Press in 2017. He is a professor at William Paterson University, where he teaches courses on the history of the British Isles, the British Empire, and the history of crime. So welcome, Dr. Robb. Let me share your PowerPoints. Let's see. Hold on a sec, where are we? Sorry, here we go. Okay, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks to everyone for attending. And I would like to start also giving a special thanks to Beth Sack-Cohen of the Newark Public Library for a lot of the very fine work she has done on the history of Jewish women suffragists in New Jersey. I'm drawing on some of her work today. The peak of the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century coincided with the peak of Jewish immigration to the United States. And the nation's burgeoning Jewish American communities quickly became avid supporters of votes for women. Indeed, support for suffrage was probably greater among Jews than among any other immigrant groups at the time. Although comprising only about 1% of the United States population in 1910, Jewish women and men played an outsized role in the suffrage movement, both in the nation as a whole and in the state of New Jersey. Slide. The first woman in America to make a demand for women's suffrage was Ernestine Rose, a Jewish immigrant from Poland. Rose publicly advocated for equal suffrage in an 1846 speech in Michigan, 2 years before Seneca Falls Convention. A rabbi's daughter, Rose left behind religious Judaism for life as an atheist, socialist freethinker. This background certainly set her apart from other pioneering American suffragists like Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who came to the women's suffrage from backgrounds in abolitionism and remained closely allied to Protestant Christian reform movements like temperance. And as Dr. Adams pointed out, that was a similar background for African-American women involved in the suffrage movement as well. Ernestine Rose was one of the few Jewish women involved in the early 19th century suffrage movement. This situation changed as the country's Jewish population swelled during the late 19th century. Slide. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 2 million Jewish immigrants entered the United States, most of them fleeing intense religious persecution within the Russian Empire. Jewish Americans soon formed large urban enclaves in northeastern states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. In New Jersey, the largest Jewish communities were found in Paterson and Newark, where many of the newcomers worked in manufacturing and trade, especially the garment industry. In Newark, by 1910, there were around 50,000 Jewish residents, comprising some 20% of the city's population. Now, the persecution and economic marginalization of Jews in Eastern Europe fostered a strong sense of social awareness and political activism, with an especially pronounced tendency towards unionization and radical politics. Many of the Jewish men and women who came to the United States had been involved in the labor movement and socialism, and they continued these activities over here. American Jews generally supported the extension of voting rights to all people, regardless of race, religion, or sex, seeing any restrictions of the franchise as a potential threat to themselves. The political activism of American Jewish women also sprang from their unique background in Eastern Europe. In Jewish communities, women were usually an integral part of the family economic unit, working alongside their fathers and husbands as peddlers, shopkeepers, and garment workers. Because of restrictions on the open practice of Judaism and frequent pogroms against Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, women also played a vital role in maintaining Jewish worship and ritual practices within the home. Given this heritage, Jewish American women were often independent-minded, outspoken, and critical of male authority. Jewish American suffragists resisted ghettoization within the women's rights movement. Rather than forming separate Jewish suffrage societies, they preferred to join existing groups despite anti-Semitism and Christian evangelicalism that characterized many mainstream American suffrage organizations. Nonetheless, Jewish women favored the most progressive and militant varieties of suffragism, and they helped to invigorate the New Jersey suffrage movement by cultivating more radical tendencies. Slide. In New Jersey, In New Jersey, the best-known Jewish suffragists promoted the most innovative and theatrical practices within the suffrage movement. For example, Martha Klatchkin, and she's the woman on the right, organized the first outdoor suffrage rallies in New Jersey in 1909. That year, Klatchkin, a 31-year-old immigrant from Eastern Europe, joined forces with Dr. Emma Gans to organize the Progressive Women's Suffrage Society in East Orange. They held a series of open-air suffrage meetings around New Jersey, beginning in Orange. Now, while outdoor rallies might not seem especially outrageous today, a century ago, many women, especially middle-class white women, feared that by making a spectacle of themselves in public, they would lose respectability. And that was a point that Lisa made very clearly in her presentation. Klatchkin was unashamed of her militant approach. On the eve of a suffrage rally in Newark, she instructed a reporter, quote, "Do not refer to us as suffragists. We are not suffragists, but suffragettes." Do you know the difference? No? Well, suffragists are those who think they can accomplish this great reform at drawing room receptions and pink teas. The suffragettes believe in up-to-date methods, the holding of open-air meetings, and the like. Martha Clatchkin later played an active part in the suffrage army organized by General Rosalie Jones in February 1913 to hike from New York City to Washington, D.C., and joined the first National Suffrage Parade scheduled to coincide with Woodrow Wilson's inauguration on March 3rd, 1913. And Lisa talked about that a little bit. And this was the parade in Washington was organized by Alice Paul. Slide. The longest stretch of the suffrage hike crossed New Jersey from Newark through Elizabeth, Rahway, Metuchen, New Brunswick, Princeton, and Trenton. And here the marchers are, they're in Lincoln Square in Newark, about to begin the march. The hike was a huge public relations success. The suffragists were accompanied by reporters and photographers and were greeted by supporters and local dignitaries along the way. Clatchkin quickly emerged as one of the most colorful hikers, dubbed the Little Corporal on account of her short stature and steely determination. And Little Corporal had been a nickname for Napoleon Bonaparte. A reporter for the Tampa Times described Clatchkin, quote, as the gamest little woman I ever met. Frail, weighing less than 100 pounds, she keeps plugging on. Day after day, she trails the leaders by 4, 5, 6 miles. But when the final count is made, she is always there. She looked at me and the fire leaped into her eyes. I died for the cause. It's my whole life. When raucous undergraduates from Princeton University, notorious for its conservatism, came to mock the hikers, Clatchkin was happy to debate the students. She told them, quote, we don't object to men. It's just the opposite. We love everybody. We are doing this for the sake of men. It's a humanitarian movement. Slide. Another Jewish suffragist from New Jersey with a gift for publicity was Dorothy Frooks of Bayonne. The daughter of Jewish immigrants, Frooks was known as the baby suffragette, or the baby suff. Precocious speaker, Frooks began addressing suffrage rallies at the age of 11. While attending Bayonne High School in 1913, Frooks organized the Equal Justice League among her fellow students. Like Frooks, many of the girls who joined the league were Jewish. Frooks certainly made good copy, with reporters describing her as, quote, an aggressive young suffragette or an enthusiastic worker for the cause. The Jersey Journal insisted, quote, a mere handful of men or a congress of them, for that matter, can't faze Miss Frooks when she gets warmed up to a debate or address on women's suffrage. In January 1914, a 17-year-old Frooks publicly challenged New Jersey Assemblyman Magnus Bredenbach to debate on women's suffrage. When Bredenbach remarked at a legislative hearing on suffrage that the antis have the better argument, Frooks, who was listening in the gallery, called out, is that so? Well, I'd like to debate the subject with you. She later issued a formal challenge, which Bredenbach declined. New Jersey suffragists gloated that the assemblyman was afraid to debate a girl. And the Jersey Journal joked that Bredenbach was hiding out in a cyclone cellar somewhere in the wilds of New Jersey. Women like Martha Clatchkin and Dorothy Frooks were not afraid to push the envelope, subverting traditional notions of ladylike behavior. Other Jewish women in New Jersey are militant alternatives to the mainstream New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association. Slide. One such person was Augusta Levine, who at age 16 left Poland with her family to settle in Newark. She worked in her father's grocery store during the day and attended evening school to prepare herself for college. In 1893, she married Victor Parsonet, a fellow Jewish immigrant, and the couple decided to study medicine together. Augusta attended Tufts Medical School in Boston, but when the Parsonets' finances deteriorated, she quit school and worked at the Singer sewing machine factory in Elizabeth so that her husband could complete his studies. Dr. Victor Parsonet became a prominent physician and played a key role in founding Beth Israel Hospital in Newark. Augusta Parsonet became involved in civic affairs. Slide. In 1907, the 37-year-old Parsonet attended a lecture in Newark by Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the militant suffragette movement in England. The experience convinced her of the importance of the vote for women, and she threw herself energetically into the campaign for suffrage in New Jersey. Parsonet worked with fellow Newarker Mina Van Winkle to found the New Jersey Equality League for Self-Supporting Women in 1908. The League was an affiliate of the New York City League, founded in 1907 by Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The Equality League sought to broaden the base of the American suffrage movement by recruiting working-class women and engaging in more confrontational activities like rallies and parades. Renamed the Women's Political Union in 1912, Augusta Parsonette became president of the New Jersey branch in 1916. Slide. The Women's Political Union expanded its outreach to working women through cooperation with the Women's Trade Union League. Jewish women like Parsonette were well positioned to build bridges to women in the labor movement, especially among needle trade unions like the International Lady Garments Workers Union and the Hat Trimmers Union, which contained many Jewish members. Slide. Mary Dubrow was another Jewish immigrant in New Jersey who became involved with a more militant brand of women's suffrage. In her case, she worked with Alice Paul's National Women's Party. Dubrow had been born in Russia, but grew up in Passaic after her family immigrated to the United States. She trained to be a school teacher, but her career was temporarily sidelined by her suffrage activism. In 1918, Mary Dubrow joined the New Jersey branch of the National Women's Party and worked closely with State President Allison Turnbull, who recognized Mary's talents as a dynamic speaker and organizer. Alice Paul had founded the National Women's Party in 1916 to attract younger women to the suffrage movement. Dubrow, a 22-year-old school teacher, was an ideal recruit, and Paul soon promoted her to be a national organizer for the National Women's Party. Influenced by the English suffragettes, Alice Paul and the NWP employed militant tactics, such as public demonstrations and protests intended to embarrass politicians and gain publicity. Slide. Early in 1919, Dubrow, seen here speaking in Lafayette Park across from the White House, joined other members of the National Women's Party in picketing the White House. On January 6th, she was arrested with several other suffragists for lighting a Liberty bonfire. And these bonfires were often stoked with copies of Woodrow Wilson's speeches. The women refused to pay their $10 fines and were sentenced to 10 days in jail. Insisting that they were political prisoners and not criminals, Dubrow and her fellow suffragists went on a hunger strike. After several days, the authorities released the women, fearing that they might die and be seen as martyrs. Following her release from jail, Dubrow toured the country as part of a prison special for the National Women's Party. She led rallies in several major cities such as New Orleans and Chicago. Her activities were heavily covered by the nation's newspapers, which often expressed their amazement that one so young could be a forceful and charismatic speaker. Dubrow's colleagues in the National Women's Party even claimed that her, quote, magnetic personality had converted Woodrow Wilson to the cause of women's suffrage. Slide. Jewish suffragists in New Jersey also drew support from their rabbis, most of whom favored votes for women. As early as 1910, Rabbi Louis Michelson of Temple Har Sinai in Trenton spoke in favor of women's suffrage at that year's Purim services. Slide. In 1911, Rabbi Michelson became vice president of the newly organized New Jersey Men's League for Women's Suffrage, which Lisa talked about. In 1915, Rabbi Julius Silberfeld of Temple B'nai Abraham in Newark joined the Ministers' Equal Franchise League of New Jersey, which argued that denying women the vote was arbitrary, unreasonable, and unjust. Slide. Rabbi Morris Rosinski of the Barnard Memorial Temple in Paterson publicly endorsed women's suffrage, as did fellow Paterson Rabbi Louis Getz of Temple Emmanuel. Slide. Perhaps the most pro-suffrage rabbi in America was Stephen Wise of the Free Synagogue in New York City. Wise campaigned across New Jersey in the run-up to the state's October 1915 suffrage referendum. Wherever he went, Rabbi Wise insisted that America was no democracy until women had the vote. It is unclear whether New Jersey's rabbis were influenced by the state's Jewish suffragists or whether they simply shared a common progressive worldview. Though many of these women did belong to congregations where these pro-suffrage rabbis were officiated. Slide. Results from the 1915 suffrage ballots in New Jersey and New York indicate strong Jewish support for women's voting rights. Although both states denied women the vote in 1915, support for equal suffrage was stronger in Jewish communities than elsewhere. In Jewish neighborhoods in New York City, especially the Lower East Side and Harlem, men overwhelmingly favored women's suffrage. In fact, the majority of New York State's pro-suffrage election districts were in Jewish neighborhoods. Slide. Ethnic polling data for New Jersey is less precise, but figures for Newark suggest that Jewish Americans were more pro-suffrage than the city's other major ethnic groups. So I point out Newark was a very anti-suffrage city. It's a big liquor trade city, and the breweries had a lot of power here as well. So none of these groups, all of these groups you can see voted against women's suffrage, but the pro-suffrage vote among Jewish Newarkers was much higher than among other immigrant groups in the city. Slide. Jewish support for women's suffrage was often taken for granted by contemporary commentators, especially within Jewish American communities. In 1915, the American Hebrew newspaper pointed out that Jews voted for women's suffrage because, quote, of the fierce longing for democracy which dwells in the hearts of Jews, unquote, who were only recently freed from Tsarist oppression. Jewish suffragists in New Jersey had little need to campaign among their own people. Women like Martha Klashkin, Dorothy Frooks, Augusta Parsonet, and Mary Dubrow brought their progressive message of sexual equality to all Americans. Refugees from oppression, these women embraced freedom of speech and pushed America to fulfill its democratic potential. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Robb. Okay, so thank you to all three of our fabulous panelists. And again, we apologize for the technical difficulties, but everybody at this point is free, panelists, as well as those of you who are in the audience are free to turn on your camera and show yourselves if you wish, and feel free also to send me or send to the chat any questions you have for our panelists. Yes, we do. We do have to end at, I was just reminded, we do have to end at 12:05. So we may have time for just one or two questions, but we're happy to take those questions. While we're waiting for a question to come in, I have a question that actually relates to all three of your great presentations. In each of your three talks, in different ways, the 1910s end up becoming a really significant moment, right? These are the 1910s. We see new tactics for the movement, new organization. Hold on one second. Okay, new organization. And I'm wondering why you think these three, why do you think these things evolved at this particular time after decades of organizing? Why do you think the 1910s were a key decade for African-American women in New Jersey, for Jewish women in New Jersey, or for these, the marketing tactics that women in these families were engaging in? Any one of you can feel free to answer.
I mean, I would highlight the influence of the British suffragette movement and the radical tactics that a lot of people adopted. I mean, that would just be one thing I would point out, but I'm sure other people have other things to say about that as well.
Sure.
Yeah, this is Betty Adams. Certainly for African-American women, the disenfranchisement of Black men in the South amid violence and Ku Klux Klan organization was prevalent. Segregation in the North was moving. Florence Randolph, for example, would talk movingly about the problem within the problem, that is residential segregation that was taking over the North. Prior to that, working class people lived among each other, Jewish, European immigrants, African Americans, but then this racial segregations, residential segregation began moving in. And Black women who had been very active in the temperance movement and thought through reform, like the temperance union, that all of these things would change, began to realize there was nothing that was changing, and they would have to take a more definite stand.
I think there are also a lot of technological things that were going on in the early 1900s. The invention of the telephone, the airplane, the automobile, and that really allowed suffragists to do some really radical ways of getting the information out to rural voters. There were over 100 automobile tours across the state of New Jersey in 1915. And they really used those to be able to get the information to rural areas who maybe didn't have newspapers, or not everybody was able to read. And so they really were able to spread their message with much more radical new, I'll say, marketing techniques than previous suffrage.
Sure. Thank you. I have a question here that came in to just me in the chat, but it's for Dr. Adams. And one of the audience members is wondering if you can share a little bit more information about the Colored Women's Republican Club, that they were very interested in that.
Yes, during this period, African Americans were definitely of the party of Lincoln and Republican all the way. The Colored Women's Republican Club came about as Republican men, white males in particular, were trying to somehow mitigate and compensate for what they perceived would be a women's block in voting, and opened only a few chairs in the Republican organization to women. And white women decided, well, they would have first dibs, so to speak, on those chairs. And Black women realized that while they would affiliate with white women would be members of the women's political caucus, they also needed their own organization, because what they were seeking in the political arena was more nuanced, varied, and complex than what white women were seeking. So they wanted to be that powerful force. And in fact, they really were, through their missionary and church work and all of the organizations. And they had that very good network, so they could get out the vote and could do the work they needed to get done.
Yeah. I'm glad you pointed that out, because you are hearing this myth that the speaker this morning addressed, that Black women weren't able to vote until 1964, and I know that was the case in many southern states. But in a place like New Jersey, like 1920, I found I've been doing some research at the local level in places like Newark and Paterson. Colored women Black women were organizing these Colored Women's Republican clubs at the grassroots level, and they were registering women to vote, and they were, doing all kinds of important political work in New Jersey. So yeah, they were an important voting bloc in the state.
And became recognized as such, as I mentioned in the paper, that white male politicians who really wanted to woo the Black vote sought out the Black women. And not only did they woo the Black women for the Black vote, but they recognized if Black women were on the stage speaking for them, that white voters would also support them. So they were very, very active and visible in New Jersey, which was a surprise to me as well. And particularly when you're thinking of working women, domestic servants for the most part. These were not Oberlin College graduates or Howard University graduates. They were working women who felt this was something so important, and that it interwove with their religious conviction of what humanity required and what civic righteousness was all about.
Thank you so much to Dr. Adams, to Dr. George Robb, to Lisa Hendrickson for this wonderful, wonderful snapshot view of these different groups of women voting in New Jersey. We appreciate all of you who spent the time with us today, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for doing our slides for us.
Yeah, right, exactly. Better you than us.
Yeah.
And apologies for the technical problems. So.
No problem.
That's happened. Yeah.